Dr. Timothy E. Nelson was born in South Central Los Angeles, and he was raised in Compton, California in the early 1990s. And he went to Santa Monica Community College due to race and class-based conflict with the Los Angeles Police Department. His multifaceted work concerns racism, ambition, and the search for opportunity. Providing the most in-depth research on Blackdom to date, he reframes the history, focusing on the economic and the social ambitions of Afro-Frontierists, or Black pioneers. And he does this through various art forms: academic books, trade books, screenplays, painting, photography, and videography. Dr. Nelson is digitally applying his theory of colonization within the digital frontier. Let's welcome Dr. Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to jump right in. I just want to tell you first that I am wearing my father's shoes in honor of the whole theme for the next, 6 months, a mile in my shoes. So yep. My father has passed. So we're going to go right into the middle. Page 90, Chapter 5, Afrotopia. 1909. On February 19, 1909, the U.S. Congress increased the homestead allotment to 320 acres and up to 640 acres, or a whole square mile. Theoretically, provided the land was hard to irrigate, if all of Ella Boyer's children owned the maximum amount of homestead land, they would possess the equivalent land mass of present-day Compton, California. In 1910, Blackdom emerged when bitter battles became what was known as the Mexican Revolution. Militarily strategic against Pancho Villa's raids, New Mexico was on the verge of statehood, and Blackdomites had positioned themselves to take advantage of the shift from federal territory to state status. Including the era of Blackdom's roaring 20s, they indulged in Afrotopia and found exponential growth as the revival led to boom times. Consequently, more Blackdomite women joined the homestead class. Opportunistically, Frank Boyer became an assignee for Mattie Moore and Pernicia Russell under the amendment to the homestead laws. Blackdomites were a part of the homesteader boom that by 1910 helped colonize over 40 million acres with 100,000 land patents. Blackdom town site inspired Black people to homestead until the Great Depression. According to the new law, Frank was allowed to file a land patent for Mattie and Pernicia without land counting as part of his maximum allotment. Frank Boyer began a homestead patent for the 40 acres of Blackdom's town square, devoting Mattie's 35 acres and Pernicia's 5 acres, along with Ella's 160 acres. The 40 acres of Blackdom town square helped solidify the Boyer family's Blackdom legacy. Chapter 1, Boyer, Blackdom, Colonization, and Continuum. If, and that's a big if there was one person whose life encapsulated Blackdomite society and the Afro-Frontier, it was Francis Frank Marion Boyer, the quintessential archetype of Black military, ministers, and Freemasons. Frank's real life was dynamic, but popular stories about him mythologizes Blackdom and borrows from only part of his story, leaving little room for historical analysis or imagination. Frank was often introduced as the leader of Blackdom, New Mexico. In this study, Frank was recognized as one of many leaders in Blackdomite society who were trained thinkers and doers. In the 1890s, Frank first entered Mexico's northern frontier as part of the 24th Infantry Buffalo Soldiers. His unit functioned as border patrol. Black military personnel had authority and tremendous autonomy in the borderlands. Buffalo Soldiers were a vital element in the U.S. exploitation of indigenous peoples and enforced the annexation of their lands. After Frank's military service ended in the early 1890s, he returned to Georgia, where he attended Atlanta Baptist College, Morehouse College today, and trained as a minister. He was an active member of his local Prince Hall Lodge before returning to the borderlands. In the Pecos River Valley, Frank executed his Afrotopic plans. Myth-making has a place, but Frank's real life helps reveal intersections that invited Black migrants to conceive of Afrotopia with him. At the turn of the 20th century, some Black institutions grew into multi-million-dollar enterprises. Blackdom was the latest scheme with a business plan to harness the power of people who embraced hard work and who trained as ministers, military personnel, and Freemasons. Anomalous as building a town on desert prairies seemed, Blackdom was the only incorporated all-Black town in the territory of New Mexico, which became a state in 1912 during Blackdom's revival. I'm going to have Matthew help me with this isn't my final one, but I'm going to have Matthew help me with the next one. New Mexico, borderlands, and the birth of Blackdom. At the turn of the 20th century, Black folks' excogitation of a Black domain in frontier spaces evolved from an adequate set of circumstances to produce Afrotopia in Chavez County. Blackdomites believed that God's citizen conditions, collective knowledge, land, and labor were enough to start their autonomy project. New Mexico was a U.S. territory, and local jurisdictions were restricted from full enforcement of Jim Crow laws. Also, while the Black population was minuscule, their occupation of indigenous lands was useful to colonization efforts in the borderlands. Black folks understood the American Blackness condition in the territory was enhanced by self-segregation. The Blackdom Townsite Company was part of the scheme to harness Black power at the intersection of Black ministers, Black military personnel, and Black Freemasons. Moreover, incorporation helped erect a corporate veil separating Blackdomites from the unique conditions of American Blackness in New Mexico to participate unencumbered in generational wealth creation during boom times. Blackdomites expected to take full advantage of citizenship without the impositions of a white-dominated society. Black folks became landlords and matured their investment while exploiting the race citizenship loophole in the territory. The Blackdom Townsite Company was a physical manifestation of their most noble Afrocentric ideals. In 1903, Frank Boyer was intimately familiar with colonization of Mexico's northern frontier when he became one of 13 Blackdom co-founders. Frank had trained as a minister, soldier, and brought with him Prince Hall Freemasonry. Stories about Frank and his relationship to Blackdom often offer to audiences myths of both. Instead, this narrative begins during the Civil War, before Frank was born, when the Boyer family was enslaved on the Elias Boyer plantation in Georgia. In this chapter, we explore the infancy of Blackdomites' Afro-Frontier to further reconcile the relationship between black towns and prophets. And prophets, in this case, is prophet like in the Bible, not prophets from... And that's alluding to the title of chapter 3, which is Prophets, and the prophet family. So, and lastly, you ready? Okay. Chapter 4, Afrotopia. Blackdom, Du Bois, and descent into Afrotopia. The Afrotopia referred to in this chapter, the first of 3 parts, begins in a state of surrealism influenced by the omnipresence of W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, and a July 1920 letter written to him from Ruth Loomis Skeen, a white woman. She happened to live 20 miles south of Blackdom at the start of Blackdom's transition during the Harlem Renaissance. At the time, Du Bois was editor of the Crisis magazine, aimed at the betterment of black folks, as well as an outlet for the NAACP. Blackdom, an Afrotopic paradigm, was officially platted as a town in May of 1920. So July and May, all in 1920. And further matured as an investment that included oil royalties. Blackdom was a real place with a tangible means of expression that expounded on personally held notions of Afrotopia. Ontologically, Blackdomites exceeded the goals of black liberation theology as well as Ethiopianism between 1903 and 1930. On the precipice of boom times, during an age referred to as the Roaring Twenties, Ruth Loomis Skeen's letter to Du Bois therefore functioned as a testimonial of Blackdomites' successful articulation of Afrotopia, a tangible means of black expression during the period of black Renaissance. Employing Du Bois's work in a surrealistic conversation with Skeen's observation, this chapter details Blackdom's first decade while maintaining Blackdom's full trajectory expressed in Skeen's letter. Blackdomites could not predict the weather or the events of the next day. It was inconceivable that they could foresee what would happen over the course of the first 2 decades. In part due to the miseducation of black folks, we must enter Blackdom's Afrotopia behind the Du Boisian veil of blackness, knowing that Blackdomites had a belief that a good man's steps were ordered by God In short, according to their belief system, provided one was willing to apply Christian as well as Masonic ideals and concepts to the collective experience of Blackdom, God would bless them for their faithful endurance. Without knowing the future, Blackdomites assumed success was inevitable after the trials and tragedy of desert homesteading, guaranteed by God's promise. In the borderlands, Blackdomites had faith in divine sovereignty that was sure to come. Blackdomites believed in the collective spiritual and daily toil. Ruth Skeen wrote to W.E. Du Bois in 1920.
I have greatly enjoyed the sample copies of The Crisis. And if you'll send me 2 or 3 copies of the Brownie book, the Brownies book is a literary magazine aimed at African American children, I will take them and with the samples of Crisis and visit a colored settlement near here and endeavor to secure subscriptions for your good magazine. There are not many colored people in this part of our state, although we have many Mexicans, and the race feeling against them is rather quite bitter. They are not allowed to enter a white barbershop, nor to eat in a white man's eating place. However, in the northern part of the state, they own a good deal of property and are well educated and hold positions of trust and honor. Our governor is a Spanish-American born in old Mexico. Of course, historically, the Spanish people have a perfect right here, and there are persons in the state possessing a fair attitude toward them. But they are only what English writer John Ruskin calls a little group of wise hearts in a wilderness of fools. Near here is a settlement of Negroes, a little town called Blackdom, consisting of farmers who have wrenched every bit of good out of our bitter soil. They are quiet, good citizens and molest nobody. They have had little chance for cultural things of life, and I believe they would welcome an opportunity to take your papers and magazines. Of course, they may already know about them. They have a little school and a church. At any rate, I'll be glad to go over there in my car and take them the books. I've lived among Negroes all my life, have had them in my home as helpers, and know them very well. But I had never, until going to California, lived where they were not segregated.
Thank you. Thus, according to Ruth Loomis Skeen, Blackdomites appeared in full expression of Afrotopia in 1920. Unbound by the geography of the New York-based Black Renaissance movement and her ethnic background, Ruth Skeen was a poet of Irish heritage who also went by the pen name Reba Kane. She lived in places from California to New York, and although she was a white woman, per her understanding, black folks maintained their souls and knew how to express themselves. In an apparent attempt to negrotize her name, as an author, in a 1929 issue of The Crisis magazine, located in New York on Fifth Avenue, she published Dark Lover. Cognizant of the time in which she existed, Skeen's minstrel expression of her soul in poems from a position on the black side of town highlights a slightly veiled black space difficult to experience on the other side of the proverbial veil. The two-ness was used for all who engaged in the practice. That's the end of my reading.
Thank you. I think, well, first of all, thank you. I know for me, hearing kind of the cadence of your voice as you read, now when I get to reread this for the third time now, I get to hear you, which always helps. I love that opportunity, so thank you for reading. And also thanks for making me very out of my comfort zone and making me read out loud in front of others. Before we start talking, I'm actually going to ask you all a question. Sorry, I'm going off script. We just started, I'm already off script. How many of you, and we'll be honest, I'll be honest with you, knew about this history of Blackdom prior to hearing maybe about this event? Is this something you grew up with? All right, it's a good amount of people. That's great. A lot of people, it's about half. You know,
Did you? How many of you have heard about Blackdom oil? Raise your hand.
Yeah. We'll unpack that one. Cool. And for me, I mean, I'm not from New Mexico originally by any means, but still, it's something that I'm just blown away that hasn't been put in every school, and we don't talk about this all the time because it's not just interesting, but it's powerful, and it's such a moving example of what can happen through collectivity and ambition. Anyhow, and it's it's of course, like your book mentions a lot. It's a great example of an Afrotopia. Now, you didn't invent the word Afrotopia.
No.
You did invent the word Afro-Frontier.
Indeed.
So I thought that might be a good place to start. And you do this in your book as well. You have this kind of opening section called intellectual technology.
Yes.
Where you take the time to really say, here's how I'm using this language, which I love. So for tonight, if you don't mind talking a little bit about how your interpretation of Afrotopia and Afro-Frontier play out in your work.
So Afro-Frontier came about because I found Blackdom Oil Company, and the standard New Mexico narrative of Blackdom didn't include Blackdom Oil, but also the trajectory created by the original narrative did not give me a sense of what Blackdomites, who they were, what they were, how they got down. So Afro-Frontier described the institutionality in which black folks engaged Mexico's northern frontier. And I say Mexico's northern frontier, not, quote, the West. So that's a shift in understanding that it was a complicated borderlands that black folks were in. Well, they brought with them their African descendancy and also the improvised and refined notions of Ethiopia, with Ethiopianism and black liberation theology going all the way back to the Revolutionary era. So Afro-Frontier speaks to a few things, and we can unpack that a little bit later. But Afrotopia, Wilson Moses's work, Afrotopia, is where I began. He describes a postmodern movement after basically after slavery, but generally after the Reconstruction, where black folks sought either back to Africa or these autonomous spaces. And so Afrotopia mixing with Afro-Frontier and borderland studies is how those two kind of provide the flow within the book. And so, Afro-Frontier, creating it also, I had to deal with the fact that frontier is a thing. So putting Afro in front of it, I had to kind of develop that narrative, and that's why intellectual technology becomes really important at that point. So.
Which I think is a great way to kick it off, really. Yeah. And I think, too, I was talking to someone about this recently in preparation for this conversation, and it was great to watch. They had this moment where they're like, oh, so Afrotopia is not a place. It's a state of mind. It's a way of living. It's this, and as you call it, a continuum, which I think is the perfect word for it, and that gives it no end, which to me is hope and possibility. So as you know, with our earlier discussion, the idea of Blackdom oil came up, and this is one of the things you contribute to this history. There was already a little bit out there when you got your research going. There was enough for you to sink your teeth into, but I mean, as I understand it, you expanded the history timeline by about 8 years. You also pointed out they strike oil, which is huge, right? I mean, this is America. If you can strike oil at any time ever, it's almost guaranteed success in some way or another. Can you speak a little bit about your personal contributions to this history, like what you pulled out on your own that most of us didn't know about yet?
When you said struck oil, immediately I thought of the Clampets. Like, so you may have to ask your question again.
All right, fair.
You may have to ask your question again because I just Texas tea. Ask your question again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, fair. So I'm trying to collect myself. Thank you. I guess what I'm curious about is your personal contribution. What that experience is to discover this unknown history, right?
Yes, yes. Okay, so that was the other part. There was no historiographical way to describe black folks striking oil. There is a general consensus amongst historians, it doesn't matter what field they're in, that black folks had no significance whatsoever. But when I found Blackdom oil, you're talking about the 1920s, the Great Gatsby, all of these Blackdom, the Harlem Renaissance, and now you have a tangible means of expression going on. So that 8 years is during a time of great expression. So you have a rural community expressing themselves behind a veil called Blackdom Oil Company. Now, did they strike oil like the, no. They leased land to oil speculators, which allowed them to have royalties as long as oil speculation was going on their land. So how do you describe that? You have to come up with a whole new way of looking at black folks even, because what you often hear is, oh, okay, so though they just got out of slavery and, oh, they have this post-traumatic slavery syndrome. No, these were people who, yes, some of them were born under the institution of slavery. However, they were led by people who, that first generation that was outside of slavery, who were Republicans and thought through the lens of self-determination, and some of it through the manifest destiny notions, but they were black. So they had to have a separate consciousness as they were colonizers of a different kind. So Blackdom Oil Company solidified that ability to talk about them that way and extend Blackdom's history by 8 years. But if we want to be honest and more accurate, we extend it into the present. They're currently drilling nat gas on Blackdom lands, and we can talk about what they're doing with the lands later. But it's even in the present. So.
It's on the continuum.
Yes, exactly.
The other thing that I love that you brought to this history, I mean, first of all, the fact that those 8 years were gone. It says a lot, right, about who's writing the stories, right?
Exactly.
Who's in charge of this narrative, because the idea of black folk being very successful, especially in a capitalist society as they truly were, getting erased. I think we all know, it's just,
Part of it was at the same time what was happening was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. So in 1917, Birth of a Nation comes out, 1915, and by 1917, World War I, you have Birth of a Nation playing in the theaters of Roswell. Well, Roswell's not that big, so this is a great film called by the president, right? So you have this flocking to Birth of a Nation, which idolizes the Ku Klux Klan. So as black folks, you have World War I ending, 1918, 1919, black folks strike oil. And then you have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and they inaugurate their first Klan, and first Klan chapter in Roswell, Klan chapter number 15, Pioneer Klan chapter number 15, in 1924. So the erasure was a dual situation where black folks was like, okay, we are going to have to be less visible. So that erasure also came with their secrecy, but they were used to secrecy because they were Freemasons, ministers, military men, so they were used to being able to even exist in public but talk in code. So that erasure comes a lot with the rise of the invisible empire. So,
well said. The other part you brought to this history was a very left out and very lesser known women's history. And some of my favorite figures are the females that help support this. Mitty Moore.
Yes.
Incredible.
Cinematic. The beauty of the Blackdom Oil Company is it wouldn't have happened without black women. In fact, Blackdom wouldn't have existed without black women. So the key to understanding this new narrative of Afro-Frontierism is that we, similar to the black church, put black male figures out as ministers, but black women also thrusted themselves at the forefront as homesteaders, as oil barons, as part of the Blackdom Oil Company. And so if you look at Ella Boyer, after 10 kids, she decides to homestead 160 acres. Mittie Moore, okay? She lives in Roswell, but decides to homestead in Blackdom, 3 miles south. And that 3 miles was important because she was a madam, a bootlegger, a gunslinger, and other things. So imagine a madam, a bootlegger, a gunslinger, black, in the Wild West, quote, and ministers, military men, and church ladies. It's not gonna, there's gonna be some tension. So 3 miles away is basically the boundary of where other blackdom can exist. Other ideas about the world can exist, including bootlegging and gunslinging. So the women were very important, also very dramatic. You have Queen Esther Heron. Her name is Queen Esther Heron. Currently, her land is used as a Nike missile site silo. We can talk about that later. But so Blackdom is current and it's dynamic, and women were the key to that dynamism. You have Luberta Prophet. I could just keep going on about all of the different contributions. You have Jane Chisholm. Now, the Chisholm family, have you heard of the Chisholm Trail, right? Did you know that Chisholm is also a part of a black part of the family? So you have John, we can go on. Benjamin Chisholm was the black child of a former enslaved person who was married to Chisholm on the Chisholm Trail. So they moved to Roswell, and then they're able to exist as human beings once they cross the Texas border. That we could talk about that later. But the women were the ones who were the midwives, for example. Ella Boyer was trained at the Lucy Laney Institute in Georgia, and she brought life into Blackdom. She's quoted as saying, "I brought so many kids in, I can't even count them." That's how many she brought in. So, yeah, it wouldn't even exist without the women.
Yeah, and I was raised by very strong women who I know nothing would have existed, I think, without them, and that's true in every bit of history. And I'm grateful you bring that to light. And alongside these women, you had this, I think of it as the triad. Maybe you gave me that word, but as you keep saying, ministers, Masons, and the military. And this is kind of, in either one of these lanes, it has its own significant history, and it's compelling in their own right. But as they all come together, it's definitely one of these moments where, it's how do you say it? The sum of the parts is greater than the whole, right? And so, you have this representation of spiritual leadership of the ministers, right? You got the social political of the Freemasons, and of course the power and strategy of the military, right? And this trifecta is throughout the whole book. Yep. In some ways, it is the book. So, can you just how does this all come together? And how does this lead into Blackdom?
So that's part of what I've brought to the field as well. A lot of times, you'll find that most historians will stay away from talks about Freemasonry. It makes them nervous. So, again, if you ever get a historian to talk to, ask them about Freemasonry, and I guarantee you they will start curving you. Well, and they'll start hemming and hawing, but
unless it's you,
yeah,
then
unless
you
it's
just
me,
dive
unless
right
it's
in.
me,
Yeah,
unless it's
okay.
me. So the triad, I again didn't invent that. I got that from the Bible, but I was able to use it because the triad is emblematic in the continuum. Like when you see the milestones in the continuum I describe in the book, you'll see ministers, military men, and Freemasons. They may not all be separate. It may be one person. Like in Blackdom's case, Frank Boyer was a minister, a military man, and a Freemason. So that triad allows for the nurturing of autonomy projects, going back to Nova Scotia and the Ethiopian regiment, or the loyalists who sided with the British in order to fight the, well, I guess they're Americans now, but to fight the revolutionaries. So you see this in Liberia. In 1821, you see the first crew was a bunch of ministers, military men, and Freemasons. And then you take it on into the borderlands, Mexico's northern frontier, and you find it in Buffalo Soldiers, chaplains, and those chaplains were usually Freemasons. So once you find that formula, now you have to come up with something cool to talk about. So you call it I call it the revolutionary triad. So yeah.
Well, that sounds, I mean, it's accurate, right?
Yeah.
And it weaves in all of these crucial components in a, I mean, this is like colonialism, the height of well, one of the many eras of colonialism in our country. And I think and it's another through line of the book that we could also do a whole another conversation on, is this idea of leveraging these sorts of identities, right? Whether it's being a minister, Freemason, or military, personnel, or even just capitalism itself is a path towards sovereignty. And it's this I think of it as like social hacking, right? You're going to use the tools, you're going to turn them against the system, right? It's a little bit of a saboteur kind of mentality. And you talk about this a lot in the book. And so it's moments like, you have the Blackdom founders, and they completely manipulated these systems of oppression. And it's things like creating a corporation, which still today usually has more rights than any of us. That's something that I think we should all be really aware of. That a lot of corporations have more rights than any people. And for Black folks in the frontier, this was an opportunity. It was a shield, right? It was this way that it's more than passing, right? It's actually excelling and breaking through all these boundaries. There's that. There's using second-class citizenship in the frontier. You're the historian, so I'll let you go further.
First, we'll start with the frontier. Let's back up and say frontiers. Okay. Because this is, I'm coming from I'm looking through the lens of borderland studies. I think in terms of many frontiers instead of there just being a western frontier, which then evokes notions of emptiness, and then we're manifest destiny, going to go and civilize this space and then build something up. Instead, many frontiers created out of the chaos of colonization. So we'll start there. What's the other part of your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious about this strategy and the different ways. So you have we do the corporation.
Yes.
But the frontier space is different, right? There's no rules, or the rules are absolutely different than,
So yes. So in this case, in this particular frontier, it's a territory, not a state. And if you've looked at some of the things going on in Puerto Rico, part of it has to do with the fact that it is still a territory. So in a territory, as a corporation, in a lot of ways, you have way more flexibility to maneuver, no matter who you are, because the corporation is more important, because it's a federal institution that's running this thing called New Mexico at the time when they start, which means that Jim Crow laws, which come out of local governments, couldn't be fully enforced. So there was a deal, and this wasn't like a treaty or anything, but a deal amongst the Confederate-leaning migrants that the Jim Crow line was at the Pecos River. And what you will find is that the Pecos River is 5 miles east of where Blackdom started. And in fact, Frank Boyer was next to the Pecos River when he first homesteaded in Blackdom. Well, in Dexter, which then was able to convert into being Blackdom, part of the Blackdom institution. But yeah, so the laws of Jim Crow weren't able to be applied. So it allowed for a whole lot more of the energy of Freemasonry to exist. It allowed more of the church to exist, because remember, churches are places to attack. And looking at it from a military standpoint, you also have the New Mexico Military Institute. Okay? Now, it was originally called the Goss Institute, named for Robert Goss, who was a Confederate colonel. Okay? So this is in the middle of, this is Roswell. And so the whole city was set up around this militarized situation. So when you have black military men like Frank Boyer, there is some agency in a space, even though Roswell was kind of styled as a southern oasis. So a lot of these rules are being bent even by the Confederate leaning, because they kind of wanted their oasis to exist peacefully.
Right, and even like segregation, for example, this idea of separate but equal. And we know that, the white population overall was not focused on that but equal part. But once you get to the frontier, that starts to kick in, because there's not only a white dominant power anymore.
Yeah.
You have the Spanish, you have the indigenous, and yeah, it makes sense why this is such a fertile territory for this kind of work to emerge. We got our time markers, so before we slide into our audience questions, the one I would love to cover a little bit is talk about mutual aid.
Oh.
Because it's incredible to me that, and it's something that I hope we can learn more in our world today, but there's these solidarity networks that are created in Blackdom. And not just in Blackdom, between Blackdom and Roswell, right? And there's an intelligence that gets shared, there's information and knowledge, there's resources. Could you just talk about that role of mutual aid, in the Blackdom community?
Yes, and Marissa whispers confiscation of indigenous lands connected to me. So I will bridge the gap between those two as well. Blackdom was on confiscated Mescalero Apache reservation land. And what was your question?
Mutual aid.
And the mutual, because I got to bridge these gaps, because I'm thinking in Western history and borderland. Mutual aid is a part of the autonomy project that is consistent throughout Black history, throughout the African diaspora, mutual aid. So after the confiscation of indigenous lands, they did start to see, there is some room here for us to maneuver. And the only way we're going to do it is through mutual aid. So I'll give you an example. Frank Boyer, he starts his homestead, but it means absolutely nothing until Blackdom its charter is amended in 1911. Well, that's almost a decade after the Blackdom Townsite Company started. So the mutual aid part, if that does not develop, nor does Blackdom Oil during the boom time. So, so yeah, that's the mutual aid part is key. I mean, the mutual aid part comes out of the 1700s, where you're talking about different societies growing up for the formerly incarcerated or formerly enslaved who were able to find refuge in, quote, the North. Well, the borderlands and Mexico's northern frontier has always been a refuge, well, for the most part, for people escaping the incarceration of enslavement and the movement westward. So. And mutual aid was the only way that they were able to survive. And that mutual aid was also not simply amongst themselves. You also had some indigenous communities that were important to their survival. And you had Irish communities that were important. You had Asian communities that were important within this mutual aid. So mutual aid wasn't just about an insular thing. It was also who all are of this consciousness, particularly the consciousness that includes an Afrotopia.
Yeah, I think for me, the power of mutual aid, I mean, there's all over history, right? You can see this, you see it now. Basically, when people give up on waiting for their government to have some respect or some support, right?
Yeah.
And to me, this is really helpful because it's a sign to me that human beings, we can just be human beings together.
Yes.
We don't need some massive force to like box us in to do this well. I think naturally, this is who we are as people.
Yeah. To that end, you will find that in Blackdom, there weren't simply just, quote, black people. One of the largest landowners and a part of a black family was an Irish woman, a part of the Heron family. So, and this was the era of, no Spanish, no Mexicans, no Irish, no dogs, that era, so.
All right, I've got like 100 questions, but I'm going to stop here. But we'd like to open it up a little bit for you all, if anyone would like to pose a question.
Don't be shy.
Or comment. This one right here.
It's easier, cool. You mentioned at the beginning, before the discussion really got into it, that you, Dr. Nelson, had some other projects. I was wondering if a screenplay is in the works.
I have to check with Marissa first if I'm going to talk about it, but yes, that's the end. So I've already written a screenplay, and we just did a stage play in June of some of this work. So yes, that is the deal. That is why Afrotopia and Afro-Frontier is in front of you now, figuring out how to use this new language, this new consciousness in order and create a visual that is different. So if you look up Mighty-More Chronicles on like IMDb, you will see how that was formulated. And even that is a little bit tamed compared to what I envision a screenplay would be like. But yes, and if you would like to collaborate, Marissa's right next to you. Make sure you exchange. Because I do deal with black women. I do not like to speak for black women or even put my words in their mouth. But I do because I'm lending my privilege. But it would be good if I can have a collaboration of some kind. So. I can't see. Danielle Reddick. She. Can you stand up? We had a stage. We had a stage play. Yes. Danielle played Dixie Porter, someone I did not mention, and this is while she was in Tosca, which was at the opera. So I thank you for showing up today. I know you're probably busy. You probably have another play going on, but yes. So yes.
Anybody else? We have one over here. Thank you.
Dr. Nelson, I'm interested. Actually, I have two questions.
Okay.
Do you want them both at once? Or?
One at a time.
Do you know anything about what the approach to education was there? What would be the hopes and visions for educating the children who are there?
Yes. So I'm glad you asked that. I never get a chance to say that, and I don't put it in the book because I have to write a second book, so I can actually. But in the second book, what will be in there is that Blackdom had an HBCU, or a historically black college. It was called the Blackdom Normal School. And so their approach to it was to have education all the way through the college level. And a lot of the people who were the leaders of the town had formal education outside of grade school, outside of 8th grade. Yes, so their education was as far as they could go. Philosophically, also agriculture, and that kind of thing. So spiritually, so yes, it covered the whole spectrum. And then even if you look in 1910, when Blackdom was going through its transition, the one thing that they did was sent out to the state education, entity and asked for curriculum. And this was printed in the Santa Fe New Mexican. So they wanted everyone to know that they were educated too. So.
And you had a
Thank
second
you.
question?
Second
Part two.
This is more personal. I'm just really interested to know what was the seed of this research for you. Where did it begin? What was the root?
My father. My
Cheers.
father, I had to get to know him. And he's a complicated character and a complicated person. And so I then figured out that he was the son of a cowboy. So my grandfather is from Lott, Texas. Okay, and I know you don't know where that is because it's literally a lot. But think of Fort Worth. And so this is a small town compared to Fort Worth. And so after, and this is the later years, so I'm looking at memorializing and my grandfather and my father has already passed. And so I'm looking at the patriarchs of this cowboy culture that I grew up. Now, I didn't know it was cowboy culture. I didn't know it was I didn't know black cowboys at all. And my grandfather never stopped wearing his black cowboy boots. Like, he is probably still wearing them now, and he is in the hospital. So I knew he was a cowboy, but I didn't. And so, he definitely had a Cadillac, and but he also had a Jerry curl. So it was so I had to reimagine what cowboy meant, because he never wore a cowboy hat, right? So it was so in going through the journey of that, I was able to get here, but the root was the fact that I grew up in a cowboy culture that wasn't focused on animals and farming. It was the urban cowboy that moved to Compton, and there's even something called Compton Cowboys. There are, I keep
In the
talking
book, there's
forever about
some
that.
really good excerpts about you and your father, and also you and your daughter that are really another continuum for another book, another conversation.
Definitely.
I believe there's another question right here.
Well, my understanding is that schools were segregated in Roswell.
Yes.
And so that's why Blackdom had their own school, because we couldn't go to the public schools in the surrounding communities. And I think that part of the school is still standing, if I'm not mistaken. In some part, there's something still standing in Blackdom, not much, but something. But it did take a lot of energy and a lot of creativity and a lot of enthusiasm for people to homestead that.
Oh, yeah.
And water was a big issue. And when you think of how people were able to develop a whole town of their own and get water, and one of the requirements for homesteading was that you had to work it, and it had to produce to be able to get your 600 and something.
640, 320, or 160, depending on how well how close you were to the water or how easy it was to get to water. Yes.
But and is it my understanding too that not only were African Americans having to go to their own school, I think that Hispanic and American Indian kids could not go to the Roswell Public School or Vido or or any
That-
of the. Well, Vida was
Yes.
another sort of black town.
Yes.
But anyway, that was my
So,
comment.
so yeah, the segregation, it increased over time. So there was an integrated school before 1915, birth of a nation, the increase and rise of white supremacy. However, the colored school was the main place where they were educated. Now, what you will find is it increased after Blackdomite children went to Roswell High School, for example, and they would complete all of what they needed, and they still would not get their diplomas. So that's when the colored school became a lot more important in order to get them their degrees. And they would take those degrees and then go to California. Or that's also another reason why staying in Roswell became a challenge. It became a challenge on many fronts, and especially in schools. So, yes, thank you.
Got one over here.
I have two questions as well. My first is you mentioned people being born in Blackdom. What were the experiences of the children that were born there? And I'm curious, from a medical perspective, how health was dealt with on the frontier.
You have two elements here, and a lot of it, I'm going to call it conjecture because I don't have documents of, medical records. I don't have those kinds of things. But what I know about reading the historiography around frontier medicine, again, like I said, Ella Boyer was trained at the Lucy Laney Institute as a midwife. So that's where the medical advice came from. It came from her and all of her apprentices who helped with those births. Now, there's one that I have to include, which is Mittie Moore. Okay? Mittie Moore was a madam, a bootlegger, and gunslinger, and homesteader, and a part of the Blackdom Oil Company. Now, what does she have to do with the medicine? How important do you think alcohol was to the medical field in the West?
Yeah, pre-penicillin.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So if you have a house of assignment or a whorehouse, there's going to have to be some medical attention given in many different ways in order to maintain that business. So that's why I say it's conjecture, but we know that these things were a part of, these weren't just human trafficking rings in what we see today. This was also a place where men got their mental health ideas from. Some women in the house of assignment would have conversation with lonely men who are out on the frontier, who came from the frontier, who came from the East Coast and they're missing their home and so on. So, you get a cold every now and again. So the medical part, I do not have records. So as a historian, I'm not able to give you a definitive answer on anything except of Ella's education. But we do know that a lot of those, the medical element of it came from the women and also some of the men who were in the military. So the military has its own component as well. And also some of them were formerly enslaved peoples who also had their medicines that often can be, herbs in the way that you cook things, and the spiritual nourishment came from the pastors. So that's a long answer to a lot of conjecture, but that's generally how the medicine and medical part of being on the frontier evolved.
We have time for one more question.
We have a couple more questions. Yeah, we have a little bit of time.
Are you all willing to stay beyond our scheduled time? All right, cool. We'll do a couple more.
So I'm curious if you talk about agriculture in the book, and how do you see the role of these agrarians in creating the city and then also in its demise?
I philosophize about agriculture, seed time and harvest time, right? I do not go into agriculture because I expect to collaborate with actual botanists and so on to really get into the detail of it. I didn't want to, I wanted to do it justice. So I, in the book, also talk about how the experiments that were going on in, as far away as Lubbock, when you're talking about the, what I call the interior of the continent. So I talk about the agriculture in those ways, and I speak in terms of their ability to feed themselves. So if I am talking about agriculture there, I want to give you a picture. So what I do, for example, is printed in the newspaper. They describe the Negro Thanksgiving of 1911. Okay? And they had, has anyone been to Toastmasters before? This was a Toastmaster event. And Frank Boyer was the Toastmaster. And so you had various Blackdomite men, in this case, talking about the business, agriculture, pumping, windmills, and so on. But what you find in that article is that all of the food for this large banquet of Blackdomites all came from Blackdom homesteads. So by 1911, they were already self-sufficient when you talk about agriculture. So that's the nuggets that I put in there. I do not go into detail about how they were able to deliver, although their homestead records do a good job of giving you a little bit, but the depth of it, I do not.
That's for the next book.
The number of times that you said, we'll get to that. That's another story.
Yes.
It speaks of more and more and more coming. That your exploration of Blackdom, New Mexico, is a kernel, and it feels like it's blossoming, 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 and taking as many directions as that community must have taken to exist as long as it did, under the circumstance of New Mexico's statehood. And how much that must have changed just from the ability of being a territory and having the, I want to say oppression of the state of New Mexico come on it.
Yes.
This is
No,
a
that's
state
what
that still
yes.
cannot feed its children.
Yes. Yes. The state of New Mexico. What was the first part that you mentioned? Because I'm
Actually, I
thinking
wanna
about the
speak
state
to
of New
that
Mexico.
part a
Oh,
little
go ahead.
bit.
Go ahead. Go.
Think about how this is, you referring to, that's another story.
Yes.
You're referring to, that's another time. And it feels like an episode, chapter 1.
Yes.
The big chapter.
Uh-huh.
Chapter 37.
What I,
100, it all comes together. However, when it comes together, it's still more.
yes.
If I may, I've known you for a minute now, and I've gotten to watch your progression through this research, which has been mind-blowing. I mean, truly. There is so much. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying, and it's why I started the conversation with we're just getting into this. The book does a really good job of, I think it's really a baseline, but like you can go on so many trajectories and give him a drink and he will.
Yes.
You know, it's
Maybe
really
a week,
worth
but,
it. You don't even need the drink. Give him some coffee. He's just there.
Yeah.
But
So, yes. So my dissertation, every chapter of my dissertation is its own book. This is a primer to get us all on the same page, because the other books I will not do as much explaining of things like ministers, military men, and Freemasons, of Afrotopia, Afro-Frontier, Mexico's northern frontier. Like all of these things are new ideas to people who have indulged in the West. And so I'm literally well, not forced to, I really like what I'm doing, transitioning all of us to be more inclusive in the way that we are consciously describing a place like Santa Fe, for example, which was here before the state. Yet, when you hear Santa Fe mentioned, often we are thinking in terms of 100 years. You get what I'm saying? So in order to think in those terms, yes, this is a primer so that we can start thinking in a longer trajectory, particularly amongst the African diaspora, because what I tried to do is to get us to stop thinking about 1619, not stop, but recognize 1619, the project of enslavement on the East Coast, and think deeper about 1519. 1519, you had people like Juan Garrido, an African, a Congolese man, converts from his Moorish roots to being a Catholic, and then he goes to Tenochtitlan, or, quote, Mexico City. Well, it had to be colonized to become Mexico City, and this is in 1519, and he gets a land grant from the Spanish crown. So this black man is in 1519 in, quote, Mexico City with large amounts of land. Now, if black folks were in Mexico in 1519, do you think they had any babies? Just saying. But that's 100 years of babies going up the Santa Fe Trail before 1619. So, yes, we are just getting started. It's a long answer. Yes. This is Marissa, by the way. She's the institution.
So Dr. Nelson, I heard demise.
Demise. Blackdom still exists. Demise. When demise assumes a ghost town, right? Right now, currently, remember Esther Heron I described? She started her homestead and finished her homestead in 1917. That family still owns 1,500 acres of Blackdom Commons, and that's just one family. So its demise isn't necessarily demise if you have 100+ years of black folks owning land. And not just owning land like owning land, homesteaded land, which is different than owning land because this land can't be foreclosed on for any reason. This goes from one heir to the next. So if you have black folks who have been owning land for 100+ years, there is no demise. It's just there will be a rebirth at some point. Continuum.
All right, let's do, we have one last question over here with the lovely Linda Duke.
Thank
Linda
you
Duke.
so much, Dr. Nelson. This is fascinating. And your reference to all the ideas about utopia and dreams for a better life, it made me think about the way when Black Panther, the Hollywood film, came out.
Screenplay.
It generated a lot more discussion of black futurism. But it strikes me that you are writing about in a way, the history of those ideas. So I kept going back and forth between Blackdom and Wakanda the whole
Forever.
time you were talking. So I just wondered what thoughts you have about that.
Okay, y'all are opening up the big can. Afro-Frontier is a designed to piggyback on Afrofuturism. So Africa, in the same way Wakanda is important, I want Blackdom to be have a similar importance, right? And so when you think of Afro-Frontier, it would be good to think in the same way you think of Wakanda. Indeed, indeed. I'm trying not to go down a rabbit hole because this is the last question. I want to end well, but I hope to develop to the level of being able to tell a story on that scale. And it's already possible. The only issue when you deal in those is that you are on some level inevitably going to narrow things and shrink things down. So instead of a major movie, which I would really love because, I mean, it did make $1 billion, right? It more than likely ends up being a series of, well, I guess you could do sequels and prequels. We're going to talk at the end. But yes, this is a place of intersections of many peoples. And in Wakanda, yes, you can see the Africans. In this place and space, the thing that is going to develop more so is how intersectional it was, how interdependent it was in Mexicans in particular. So, yes, that is exactly where I thought too. Even when I'm writing it, I'm thinking in terms of Wakanda Forever. So, you know, if you really are a connoisseur of the Black Panther comic, you will find some influence here a bit, particularly with Frank Boyer. I try not to mythologize him, but, you know, they already did, but I took him to the next level. He's you know.
I love that. I like that you break down the myth, only because it just means we can do this too, right?
Yes.
Like it takes that apart. So I'm
That's
glad.
it.
It's another thing we'll get into.
Another.
There's a great moment, just real quickly, to the comment of Wakanda is, you know, Wakanda's not a real place, right?
So that's the other part.
Right, but this isn't knowledge for everybody. There's some people like, man, I got to go to Wakanda. And it reminded me of this moment you talk about with your brother, right?
Oh.
And it's like, you know, he hears about the work, and he goes on, and he comes to see you, he sees you graduate, all that experience. It's not until he sees you in a conference.
He sees me.
And with all these other, you know, experts. And he goes, oh, Blackdom's real.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I think also speaks to...
no, how he says it is this. So I'm up on the panel, and Marissa's in the crowd like that, and I think he's sitting behind you, and he goes, oh, I thought he made that up. Like... But 4 years prior, he is the one at my PhD graduation taking the film and going, oh, you did it. What did I do? You thought I made it up.
You tricked him into thinking it's real.
Yeah, but, you know, we from Compton, so he didn't know if I made it up or not. You know, I could be just hustling. Like, that's the way that's my father, you know. Yeah, he also wants to know when I'm going to make some money, so.
I did want to say one thing, that many of the Boyers are still living. As a matter of fact, Gertrude Boyer, who lived in Albuquerque, just passed away last week, I think.
Oh.
But the Boyers are still telling their story.
Yes.
And they have passed that story on to their legacy. I went to school with Marcus Boyer.
Okay.
Wow.
I graduated.
I know what you're talking about.
In 64. I think Marcus even passed on. But one thing about the Boyer family is that they have continued to keep the story of Blackdom alive. They passed it on through their generations. And there are other families too from Blackdom who really, many of them moved to Roswell, still alive. I don't know if some of you know Rodney Bowe.
Oh yeah, he's of the
is a descendant of
Wagners.
Of Roswell.
Dr. Nelson is connected to about 400 to 600 descendants. He's got Facebook pages for each family.
So, but it's exciting to know that African Americans have always valued oral tradition and keeping the story going. And I'm so happy that some of the descendants of Blackdom have passed their stories on and are continuing to tell them, so that many people do know about Blackdom, but most don't. But and when we were in DC visiting the National African American Museum, they have a whole section on Black towns, and Blackdom wasn't mentioned.
I know.
We're going to try to fix that.
There was a Black town in New Mexico too.
That's right.
But I just wanted to say that happy that the story of Blackdom hasn't been forgotten, and many more people are now finding out about this wonderful.
So I go to a Boyer family reunion, and I was kicked out. Yes, not in a bad way. I don't know how to describe it. You know, it was like there was a younger generation that was like, don't worry about it. That's just Auntie. So Auntie kicked me out. But I do have full contact with the family through Facebook and other ways. So this is the one way. So Michael Boyer, who is a direct descendant of Frank Boyer, so that's his great-great-grandfather, he just did a Christian rap song called Afro-Frontier. So yes, we are magnifying these families, and so you know how you have Black Lives Matter, and then you have All Lives Matter. Well, we have All Descendants Matter. That's our hashtag that we use. So that we can understand that Blackdom wasn't simply a place; it was also a consciousness that has developed within and carried through generation after generation. So when you end up with a Black cowboy in a place like Compton, and there are Boyers that are in Compton. In fact, I went to Compton, went through the Compton Unified School District, and there were Boyers teaching and coaching and that kind of thing in the Compton Unified School District. So yes, I am, and they are very much aware, and the ones who weren't are aware because I made sure to let them know and hook them up together digitally. So yes, you are right. I am glad that they have been very helpful too, because they've been very helpful, except when they kicked me out of their family reunion.
That was just Auntie. That was just Auntie, right?
That was just Auntie.
Okay.
It should have been like poetic justice.
Oh yeah, that's what I tried to do. No, don't even get me. So it was Las Vegas. So you know they had this suite up at this resort, and you know I was like, oh, okay, I don't know what I'm gonna do, and you know you got to get name tags and everything. So you know the person that was doing the name tags, I was like, oh, I'll be right back, and then so I went up to the suite and I started waving at everybody, and then I started talking, and then Auntie was like, so who are you again? You know, and started going down there. So you're a relative of who? I was like, no, I'm just a historian, and this is when I was doing my dissertation. So I hadn't published my dissertation, so nobody knows who I am. So she could have thought that I was just a screenplay writer trying to steal their stories. And she says to me, go do your own history. And I was like, okay, all right. And then I had to leave. And so one of the young men came over. He escorted me out. He's like, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. That's just Auntie. But he made sure I got out, though. So, because he wasn't going to cross Auntie. So.
All right, I'm going to stop it here. But just want to remind everybody that there are books for sale in the back, right there at that table. Dr. Nelson's going to take a few minutes and catch his breath, and then he'll be back there to sign books. And we'll stick around as long as you guys are out here and chatting. And we'll, really, really happy to have you. Thank you, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.